every complaint is just a poorly worded request. Because most of the time, the complaint is wrapped in a ton of emotion. It is wrapped in maybe some facts, but typically the complaints I hear aren't resolvable on their surface, right? Nobody wants to work anymore. This team is, this team doesn't want to work with us. She doesn't like me. Like, all of these things, so and so's lazy. Like, I'm making things up. Like, we don't have enough money to do what we need to do, right? Those are all complaints. And I hope for your listeners, they're thinking about, oh my gosh, what are the complaints I've heard? Or what are the complaints I'm actually making? Because there's a reason behind them.
Tracy, I think we've had this scheduled for at least several weeks, if not months now.
Yeah.
My
Yeah.
Yeah, I'm wrapping up this season, the 2025 season of this podcast. So I'm excited to close with some really awesome guests like yourself. I know you have a strong HR background, and that I can't get enough conversation around that for folks to sort of destigmatize some of the negative energy that happens around the word or the phrase, human resources and HR. But before we dive in, do you mind sharing your background with us and how you got to where you're at now? Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. So my background was actually really growing HR departments from the ground up. So for several organizations in nonprofit, built HR departments from the ground up. And, what's really fun about that is understanding that it's much more about people than it is compliance. Yes, there's the compliance piece. Yes, sometimes payroll falls in and all those things, they're there, but it's really about that relationship with people. And so I spent 10 years in nonprofit and then I did some consulting with nursing home organizations. So I've worked in a ton of different industries. And what's beautiful about that is we're all people and we're all human. And when we can really connect in with what that person's greatest skill sets are, how they're wired from a behavioral standpoint, we can ensure that we're creating that fit to role and that team environment so that they do have those great experiences. And of course, that's built on trust in those conversations.
Absolutely. I love that that's your focus because to your point, echoing the sentiment that yes, we need to have compliance and it's important to have fair and ethical workplaces and make sure that we're in line with business practices too. But at the end of the day, we are all people. And I feel like we can sometimes forget that as colleagues, as leaders, we can forget we're talking to a person and maybe even more so when we're in a remote setting and it's virtual to virtual, screen to screen. I've found that some of the sort of interactions in the work dynamic, you have to be mindful of creating that collaborative, encouraging space. Otherwise, it can be really hard to sustain a healthy culture when you're working remote. But I know you help folks who are all across, the different kinds of workspaces. Talk to us a little bit about your approach to building up that supportive, people-centric environment. What are some ways that we can make sure that we're building that and instilling that in our companies?
Yeah, absolutely. And really, one of the most important things that we see is what is the culture that the organization wants to create? So when we think about mission or core values, those kind of conversations, when we ground into a common ground and a common goal, now it makes these conversations much easier to have. And, so we focus a lot on definition. Like, what are our standards? What does winning look like? What are those, values in an organization? If it's teamwork, what does that actually mean? When we have clarity around that, especially in the behaviors, what happens is we start to create trust. And when we create trust, we make it safe to have conversations that are something like, hey, Rebecca, so appreciate the podcast. Yet, I'm curious about the direction we're going in because of our mission. Can we have that conversation? I'm totally making that up, right? But now in our conversations and relationships, it's creating the safety in order to have disagreements. I want to go on to that a little bit further because the different roles in the organization are going to have multiple competing priorities. Accounting is going to have a need that's going to be different than IT, that is going to be different than HR, that's going to be different than production, right? And so when we look at the multiple competing priorities of each department and align that to the mission of the organization, we can have some of the most unhealthy conversations that have conflict in them to get to a result that moves everyone forward. And that is the fun.
I'm so glad you mentioned that, Tracy, because on one hand, it requires the overall, executive senior leadership the or ownership to be strategic in planning for the business and setting those objectives and goals so that people know where they're aligning to. And then it's also understanding the why. What are we here for? What are we here to do? And you're leaving room for healthy disagreement. We don't all have to agree in business, and we can all bring our different perspectives and solutions to the table when we're in discussion, when we're working together. There's a healthy way of going about doing that. And I wonder how many people have actually experienced healthy disagreement versus conflict in the workplace. And I'm wondering, do you see a difference between what we might consider conflict as a negative and disagreement as a difference in opinion or perspective?
Yeah. So we look at conflict as there's four types of conflict, right? There's role conflict, there is task conflict. I'm missing one right now. And then we've got relationship conflict, right? And so process conflict. So role, process, task, and relationship. And when we have conflict in the first three, role and task and process, those can pretty easily be addressed if we bring it up. But what happens so often is that those conflicts turn into actual relationship conflicts, which are very difficult to address. And so, when we talk about multiple competing priorities and what we're doing and why, a lot of times those fall into those first three. And that's super, super healthy. What becomes unhealthy when it becomes personal, towards someone else. And that's when we get a lot of this usisms and themisms and all of those things, right? This us versus them. And we lose the humanity around I'm talking with Rebecca, and Rebecca, her intention is Y and Z. We're just not yet seeing eye to eye on it. So let's bring forward a conversation to really move that forward where we're both hitting what our goals are, but we need to get curious and discover what that is first.
Love the breakdown, and that goes back to what you mentioned earlier, the importance of defining words that we're using. And I really appreciate that breakdown. I think it's very illuminating, and I've definitely experienced probably all of those conflicts, not necessarily in every situation or setting. They're all the combination maybe, but one or two here or there. And I've noticed that when a conflict is recognized, or what I might consider also a misalignment in priorities and or solutions, what we're speaking to, it's oftentimes better, or it has helped me at least, to say, hey, I think we're misaligned here and we're speaking at different purposes. So let's work on getting onto the same page. I don't know if that's helpful or not. Would you recommend that, or do you have other ways of approaching those kind of difficult conversations?
Yeah, I really appreciate that kind of bringing it back into what is our goal, right? And a lot of times I'll start the conversation with, I just want to ground into what our mutual goal is and ensure that we have the same understanding of it. And sometimes right there can solve the conflict, right? And then from there, it's really digging in a little bit deeper and saying, okay, so if we both have this goal that's here, I'm curious, Rebecca, what are the priorities that are on your plate right now based on what you see? And sometimes it's based on what you're being rated on, right? IT is typically on, time getting a project done or how they're doing it or those other things that are very IT related that may lose sight of the impact on the people that they're working with, right? So when we can get curious around where's someone else coming from, it's almost like joining the dissenting forces as to why are they dissenting? What is this about? When I can get curious about that, one, I'm not in an argument with you anymore. I'm a partner with you to get to that result. So I love kind of that. Let's spend a couple beats here to figure out how we can align and maybe where we're missing. And that builds trust.
I love that you mentioned that too, because we have to be able to trust each other, even in what I think what I'm hearing too is that situation where we might not agree with each other, we still have to have a trusting environment where we feel safe to have that disagreement. And I'm curious, how often do you find working with, with other businesses and people, how often do you find that they are fearful and there's that anxiety because they don't have that established as part of that culture foundation?
Yeah, I find that happens almost more times than not, right? And when we start digging through it, a lot of times it's very unintentional. There's times where it's intentional. I mean, let's face it, we are taught to complain and blame. We're not necessarily taught to make requests and give appreciation. And so when we start to shift this, like I shared with you, I just did a presentation this morning and it was stop complaining and start gaining. And this idea that every complaint is just a poorly worded request.
Wow. I don't think I've ever heard that before, and that is very helpful, and it makes a lot of sense too. What is you're putting more purpose behind a complaint. There's actually something there.
Right.
I've heard of complaining more often than not as being counterproductive, right? Like, don't complain, if you're going to complain, bring a solution, or complaining is being seen as being ungrateful and not appreciative of what you have. And if we think about it in the way that you've positioned it and we're listening to the complaint, we can unpack and hopefully get to the root cause of where that complaint is coming from and create a better environment for everybody. Am I hearing that correctly?
Yeah, 100%. Because most of the time, the complaint is wrapped in a ton of emotion. It
Mm.
is wrapped in maybe some facts, but typically the complaints I hear aren't resolvable on their surface, right? Nobody wants to work anymore. This team is, this team doesn't want to work with us. She doesn't like me. Like, all of these things, so and so's lazy. Like, I'm making things up. Like, we don't have enough money to do what we need to do, right? Those are all complaints. And I hope for your listeners, they're thinking about, oh my gosh, what are the complaints I've heard? Or what are the complaints I'm actually making? Because there's a reason behind them. And if you think about that reason, it's like, okay, what is behind, I don't have anything to do tonight. Okay. Like that's a complaint. What's behind it? Well, what do you want? Well, I want, to go out with whatever. To me, it's like, I want quiet night tonight. Right. But like, whatever that is, what's behind it? And when we can get curious about it, now we can go, okay, what are the facts behind this in actuality? Because our brain has a way of creating a story that is not grounded in facts. And that story is typically where our complaint comes from. And so, if we're viewing every complaint as a poorly worded request, let's fact check that complaint first. And then we can figure out where to go with it.
I love that explanation. Yeah, wow. I'm just like, I'm seeing and thinking back to times I've complained or I've heard people complain. And I'm wondering, is it because we are afraid to ask for the resource, the thing, or the help that we need? And we've been sort of conditioned to just um, go straight to the complaint, or is it human nature? We're going to grumble and complain about things here and there. I'm just curious if there's a pattern there or something that prevents us from seeing clearly or communicating clearly, I guess I should say, Is there something that's preventing us from clearly communicating what our needs are versus complaining about the lack of what we have, or the maybe it's the feeling or the emotion that we're drumming up from an action that's happened for or against us, you know?
Yeah, I love that question. Here's what I find, especially in the workshops and the clients that we work with, is that there's a couple of key reasons for this. One is the complaints are happening because the individual doesn't believe they have any agency or ability to impact the result. I'm not in a position of decision making. Well, I've brought it up 3 times and no one's done anything. Another complaint, right? So that complaining is, it's a way of getting out the frustration, but it's also kind of like throwing it out there for somebody to catch. And what it does in reality is it removes you from being responsible for it. Well, the issue of that we find in the workplace is if we have all these complaints and nothing's being done about them, they grow and grow, and it creates a negative culture. And so, this idea that if we can shift that mindset even slightly into every complaint is a poorly worded request, I like to look at those complaints because they're easy. We all have them. Instead of saying, no, 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 you have to have a solution. It's like, well, let's just look at the complaints and dissect it. We can come up with our solution, but our brain right now has been wired to make complaints. So let's not make that bad. Let's just look at it and use it and figure out what's underneath it, so that for those that don't necessarily believe they have agency or a position where they can make a change, we can teach them how to make that request based in facts where it doesn't sound whiny. And I'm just going to dump it in your lap and run because nobody wants that. I don't want that. Right. But if you come to me with, you know, or if I'm equipped to break down the complaint with you to co-create a solution. Now I've enrolled you in the solution, and I'm also creating an environment where the complaints will get less and less because now you are empowered, which means you're more engaged in the workplace.
That's especially helpful in understanding it and makes a total sense when you think about it from the sort of separating yourself from responsibility and not knowing how to phrase that request. I can imagine it's probably challenging to help people understand how to reframe their thinking around complaint versus a well worded request. So, how do you help folks guide through that, or how do you coach leaders and how to help their teams through that?
Well, do we want to play? Do you have a complaint?
Yeah, let's see. I'll try. I'll choose like a generic one. So I feel like I never have time to get all my work done throughout the day. There just isn't enough hour. There aren't enough hours in the day, Tracy.
Amazing.
Do it.
Okay. Well, there's not enough hours in the day to get the work done. So, how many hours do you work a day? Okay.
Approximately, yeah.
So you work 10 hours a day. What are those key things that you want to get done every day?
Well, I want to make sure that I get to my team meetings and everybody gets attention from me. I have admin work to follow up on, reviewing, checking reports. And then I also have strategies to build out and make sure that our team is aligned with our goals for the quarter. So there is a lot of work wrapped around that. And it takes up so much time that I'm just feeling frustrated. Yeah.
Yeah. So, if we were in a workshop setting, Rebecca, what I'd have you do is write down everything that you want to do and how long those things take. Now we have facts, right? And we can take that and say, do you work 50 hours a week, then five tens? What is it that you work or you want to work? Now we can look at those facts. And when I have you then specifically take and put those hours in, we can say, do we not have enough time? And sometimes that's the answer. And sometimes it's like, well, when I look at it, I do actually have enough time. And on the flip side, if not, then we get into a really fun conversation, which is what is the most important? Like, what are the things here that actually move the needle on the goal that you're trying to achieve? And then, so now we're saying, hey, what are the goals? And do each of these actually align with the goals? If the answer is yes, and we still don't have the time for it, the question is there someone that we can delegate it to or something like AI? We're delegating a lot to AI right now. Is there a system we can put in place? So now what we're starting to do is we're taking that complaint, and our brain is brilliant at solving problems, but we don't always give our brain the right problem to solve. So it finds a problem to solve, which typically doesn't serve us.
I don't need any more to solve, but thanks, brain.
Right. And so once we have the facts, now we can look at that and say, all right, complaint. I don't have enough time to get everything done I want to get done. And I would say, take your kids, take your personal, take all of the things and put it in there. Don't just look at work. Because guess what? This works with teenagers amazingly well. This works with, this works in all areas of your life, right? And then once we have the facts around what's actually there, a lot of times that solves it right then and there. Yet, if it doesn't, now we can say, what is the impact of not having enough time or my belief in not having enough time on myself?
Yeah. If if you have that kind of belief, then it almost sounds like you're limiting your own capacity too.
Yeah.
You're putting that constraint on yourself. Oh, a good example of helping people walk through a thought process while taking action, it sounds like too. Maybe you're not doing all the things, but you are making progress in the answers and the reflection and the decisions that you're making. And you mentioned making sure that, in this scenario, time is being invested towards priority. And one of the experiences I've seen with a lot of folks, especially the team I lead, is a lack of understanding priority, or having a hard time managing priority, and so having to coach people through that. So I love the demonstration, and you approach it with kindness too. We have to understand not everybody's going to maybe think in the same way that we do. So helping walk through that thought process, I would imagine, makes them stronger and better able to handle that build of capacity for themselves.
Because what we're doing is we're not letting him off the hook of just throwing out a complaint and letting it just land. We're getting curious around what's there, but we're not making them wrong for making the complaint either, And then the impact piece is really important. Like, hey, how does that impact you? How does that impact your team? How does that impact your clients? How does that impact other departments, your family? When we can start to look at the impacts, we can see the multiple competing priorities as well.
Yes. I had no idea that we would spend so much time already spend so much time talking about complaining on an episode, but this is so valuable, Tracy. And I love that how you unpack it and think through it and walk through it. I was sharing with another guest, and our audience, just a reminder that this podcast is not for people only in title, leaders in title, and managers, and folks who are looking just for that, but we can be that leader today, now, in whatever type of role that we hold, and taking that responsibility of self and being able to work through your priorities management can be a really great start towards that. And how easy it is to fall into that trap of complaining and feeling frustrated and letting it pull us down and pull the culture down of a company
Yeah.
too if we let it.
Yeah, for sure.
Yeah. I know we're coming to the end of our time. You have a wonderful podcast yourself where you talk about people strategy. I'm actually excited to dive in deeper and want to make sure that I give it a listen. So, and we want to make sure the audience can also reach out to you too. So, where would you like folks to find you
Yeah.
online? How can they listen to your wonderful podcast?
Yeah. So our podcast is called the People Strategy Podcast. I think there's 216 some episodes out there. So there's lots and lots of information, relating to very similar to what we're talking about today. We also have something called our Tough Talk Blueprint. So if you liked this, every complaint is a poorly worded request. There's two processes in there. The one we started to talk through today of the complaint to the fact to, the impact, But then there's another that walks you through how to actually have a tough talk from that complaint. So we'll have that link in the show notes for you. Then, of course, we're on LinkedIn at Elevated Talent Consulting or Traci Austin.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Tracy. We'll have those links below and our audience can definitely reach out to connect. I love the little teaser too. Now I want to grab the blueprint for myself. So great anticipation there. And thank you again for joining me. I know that we have more we could dive into. So, folks, go listen to Tracy's podcast for all that wonderful insight and wisdom. I know I will be over there as an audience member too. And thank you all for being an audience member of the Bad Bosses Great Leaders podcast. We'll catch you on the next one.